Smith, chair of the Storer Committee, and especially Tracy and Ruth Storer for their wonderful gift to the university that made this lecture series possible. So we could bring to campus today Nina Jablonski, the former curator of anthropology at the California Academy of Sciences, currently Evan Pugh Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Human Evolution and Diversity at Penn State, as well as Permanent Visiting Fellow and Convener at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow. Nina is also elected to the California Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. Among her many honors is a Howells Prize from the American Anthropological Association for this book, her classic book on skin, A Natural History. Many of you will also be familiar with Nina's work from Skin in your courses, or the sequel, Living Colors, The Biological and Social Meaning of Skin Color, or from watching her wonderful TED Talk or seeing her on the Colbert Report. But these only skim the surface of this woman's research interests. She is one of the world's experts on the widespread genus Therapithecus, co-editor of a book on gibbons, and I have to say her CV reads like an encyclopedia of the topics covered by the discipline of physical anthropology: dental development, hair form variation, vitamin deficiencies, the anatomy, locomotion, behavior, biogeography, and paleontology of more species of African and Asian primates than I expect many of you even knew existed. She's also written on fossil leaf monkeys of Java and discovered the first fossil chimpanzee in a drawer of a museum in Africa. For more on these topics, come to Nina's noontime talk tomorrow on the evolution of primates in Asia, 55 million years of speciation, extinction, dispersal, isolation, and adaptation fueled by environmental change. As gracious as she is elegant and accomplished, she is also mentor to dozens of young researchers, including Davis's own Craig Kirkpatrick back when he was doing his PhD thesis on the snub-nosed monkeys of China. As Craig put it in a recent email from Bangkok, many of the current generation of primatologists and conservationists working in Asia stand on Nina's shoulders. The energy, the breadth, the depth of this woman's lifetime of research will be on display today as she illuminates your least understood organ by describing the evolution of human skin pigmentation and its implications for health and social well-being. Join me in welcoming back to California, Nina Jablonski.
How exceptionally nice to be here at UC Davis again, and I thank Lynn Isbell and the Storer Committee for selecting me to come. I've had a wonderful series of interactions, as I always do on this campus, which is like a crucible of great science and scholarship. Today, I'm going to share with you my now almost 25-year-long fascination with the evolution of skin pigmentation. I'm not the only person who has been fascinated with this topic. Many people, including the very accomplished Brazilian photographer Angélica Das, has been fascinated by the chromatic spectrum of human skin. And of course, I bring from an anthropological perspective a great interest in the evolution of this trait, but also the health and social meanings of it. And so I hope I won't be embarrassingly brief and superficial in this treatment, but I'm going to try to sort of give you a historical overview of my own work in trying to explain the evolution of this trait and what it has come to mean for us with respect to our health and our social interactions. If we could have the lights down a little bit, that would help. Thanks, that's great. One of the real challenges that anthropologists face when they're trying to study any system that perishes like skin is how do you do it? In the absence of molecular data, when we first started this work 25 years ago, there were very few data on the skin pigmentation genes or skin keratin genes. And so when we were studying human skin, we basically went back to the comparative method. And I became very interested in trying to understand why humans had the skin colors and the nature of skin that they did. And in order to really do this properly, we had to try to reconstruct first the configuration of skin in the last common ancestor of African apes and humans. And that was a very interesting exercise, which we wrote about at great length. But one of the most important considerations there was when we look at chimpanzees and other living catarrhine primates such as old world monkeys and other apes, what we find is most species have lightly pigmented skin covered by dark hair. The overall impression that one has is sort of, well, they're dark. But actually, their skin is really quite light, and particularly in these chimps that are actually rescue chimps. They've spent most of their lives in medical research and had lightly pigmented skin from living out of doors. Compare these to a classic photo of Jane Goodall's chimps from the Gombe stream, chimpanzees that had lived out of doors. Now, there may not be a lot of bright sunlight, but there's considerable UV in their environment, and during the course of their lives, these animals developed tans in the exposed parts of their hands and faces. This to us was significant because it indicates that the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans probably had skin not unlike this, that was lightly pigmented but had the potential for developing melanin pigment in response to challenge from strong solar radiation. And so this is pretty much as we consider the ancestral form of skin in the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. Today, I'm going to take you on a little march along my hairy timeline of human evolution. Beginning from about 7.5 million years ago, we can fight about when the last common ancestor existed, but just let's suspend that argument and go with 7.5 million and think about how the skin and hair evolved. I'll consider this in sort of 3 phases, and I'm first going to talk about the Australopithecine phase. Which many of you know lasted quite a long time, was very important, and still is being illuminated by many new fossil discoveries. And one of the sort of classic individuals that we know that has illumined our knowledge of Australopithecine biology is this beautiful skeleton discovered in the 1970s, Lucy, a nearly complete specimen of Australopithecus afarensis. One of the things that has emerged from the detailed studies of Australopithecus afarensis and its congeners is that this genus was fully bipedal and quite modern in its mode of bipedalism, but it still had tremendous arboreal climbing capacities. And when we look at the configuration of the knee, ankle, and hip joints, what we see is that although a competent biped, this Australopithecine was not the running and striding biped that comes later in human evolution. What does this mean for human skin? It means probably that we had a species, actually a whole genus, that had skin not dissimilar to that of the common ancestor and modern chimps. The Australopithecines were distinguished by being entirely African, having habitual bipedalism but not prolonged running, not a mode of locomotion that was going to build up a lot of body heat. And this becomes salient a little bit later on. Ape-like body proportions, relatively small brain. And here, when we start considering the skin, negligible selective pressure for loss of body hair, which from our perspective was primarily driven by the need for dissipation of body heat later in human evolution. But now, at the Australopithecine phase, this is not into play. And then tanning of the glabrous or naked skin, as we saw in Jane Goodall's chimpanzees. So the hair coat of the last common ancestor and Australopithecines was probably similar to this. And this is one of our reconstructions from the book Skin, which Stephen Colbert made enormous fun of because he found the breasts, I think, quite alarming. But never mind. One of the things that we rarely consider when we look at normal hairy mammals is that the protective functions of the epidermis are served largely by the hair on the surface of the body. So the epidermis itself has important barrier functions, but many of the functions to prevent abrasion, the attack of parasites, and prevent the assault of ultraviolet radiation is actually down to the protective effects of hair. So when you get rid of hair or reduce the diameter of hair, which is what's happened in the human lineage, you change the nature of skin entirely. Let's just look at the hair and the, here is a typical human hair in its follicle, and this interfollicular epidermis, which we can't see very much in hairy mammals, becomes incredibly important as a player in human skin evolution. And what we see, in short, is concerted evolution on the interfollicular epidermis to become more protective against the varied assaults of the environment, whether that be ultraviolet radiation, water, or pathogens. The early Homo phase of human evolution is probably the phase in which there's sort of the most major changes that went on. And we recognize that these changes occurred at that time mostly through good old-fashioned comparative anatomy and comparative physiology projected back onto a fossil or a set of fossils known only from fossil evidence. When we think about a beautiful specimen like this nearly complete early Homo erectus from Africa, we see a different hominin than the Lucy skeleton and from Australopithecines in general. Much more modern limb proportions, and very importantly, the lower limb joints reveal a strong adaptation for striding bipedalism and running. This was not just a competent biped, this was an amazingly swift of foot biped and bipedal runner. The early Homo phase of our evolution was originally African, but then extended throughout Eurasia, and was originally tropical, but then subtropical, involved this much more energetic striding bipedalism with nearly modern limb proportions, a much larger brain that had to be kept cool under conditions of great environmental heat and increased metabolic heat from a lot of running and striding activity, and just for fun, of course, one lineage that eventually gives rise to the Neanderthals in the circum-Mediterranean and Europe. So a very exciting time in our lineage, and I emphasize in our work the importance of two things. Homo erectus is evolving in the tropics under conditions of extreme solar radiation in East and Northeastern Africa, where we find many of the key early Homo fossils. We have a very high UV load, and we have individuals who are engaging in energetic locomotion. So this is the time when we reconstruct that most of the terminal hairs on the human body were reduced in their dimensions to those of vellus hairs. When you look at your own skin, what you see are little teeny weeny, almost, invisible hairs. They're there, and they're absolutely essential. The stem cell follicles in your skin are essential for wound healing and replenishing of the skin. We didn't get rid of hairs entirely, but we got rid of most of them at this phase in our evolution. We also, for reasons that are still clouded in the mysteries of evolutionary developmental biology, still don't know how we increased the number of eccrine sweat glands at this time. But we certainly became much more competent at dealing with heat under conditions of strong environmental heat and exercise, and at protecting ourselves against UV. Now, just a quick primer about UV. There's a lot of it that comes out of the sun. The UVC is entirely absorbed by atmospheric oxygen and ozone. Here at the equator, at one of the equinoxes, this is what the condition would be, and a lot of UVB also that manages to penetrate. It's a very energetic species of UV that can penetrate a short thickness, or a relatively short thickness of atmosphere, as you would have at one of the equinoxes at the equator. And then UVA, the longest type of ultraviolet radiation closest to visible light, penetrates the atmosphere lavishly along with visible light. So at the equator, you have a quite high but slightly seasonally variable UVB load and an incredibly high year-round UVA load. My husband, George Chaplin, who gets full marks for being the major sort of statistics and GIS person behind this work, and also the epidemiologist working on many subsequent projects, was able to cleverly distill several different NASA data sets, primarily the data set from the NASA TOMS satellite, the Total Ozone Mapping Spectrometer, and created many maps, of which I'm showing you only one, to show the annual average UV minimal erythemal dose, this is mostly UVB, on the Earth's surface. So 191 million data points sucked into an average here and displayed with the highest levels of UV here shown in hot pink and red, and not unexpectedly near the equator. But it's really important to realize that there are some exceptions. Here, in the Amazon and in other areas of high humidity, we have quite a bit lower levels of UV because of the blocking effect of the water molecules in the atmosphere. As we get toward the poles, we have conspicuously lower amounts of ultraviolet radiation, and what you notice here is that there's a huge part of the northern hemisphere that is really bereft of very much ultraviolet B radiation. And this turns out to have enormously important consequences much later in human evolution for human dispersals, because it is in this part of the world where not only do you have annually average much lower UV, but also highly seasonal levels of ultraviolet B radiation, which turns out to be a double-edged sword. UVB is highly injurious, but also essential for the production of vitamin D in vertebrate and human skin. So how do we reconstruct early Homo epidermis? We have mostly vellus hairs. We retain some terminal hairs on the top of our head and our pubic region and our armpits, but mostly we're covered with vellus hairs, and we have a functionally hairless body. We have enhanced barrier functions of the interfollicular epidermis. So the space between the hairs has been reinforced by a raft of new molecules, new protective keratins, a wide variety of other molecules that help to protect against microbial attack and that enhance wound healing. Just a raft of really fantastically enhanced functions. These have been studied beautifully by Peter Elias of UCSF over many years. And a higher density of eccrine sweat glands that I mentioned earlier, and at this time, at the same time that we have loss of most functional and visible body hair, all of these changes are occurring along with the evolution of permanently darkly pigmented skin. Not skin that was only facultatively tanned, but was actually part of the infant's legacy, as it were, from its parents. We know this. I mean, we had fun working on this years ago because our original studies of human pigmentation were before any genomic studies of pigmentation loci occurred. And we reasoned from first principles that these earliest members of the genus Homo that were mostly naked had to have had darkly pigmented skin because eumelanin pigment is so importantly protective. But then, in 2004, a very nice paper by Alan Rogers and colleagues at University of Utah was able to show very elegantly that probably that was the case. Looking at a very nice genetic coalescence model, they were able to demonstrate that the probable date of loss of variation in the melanocortin-1 receptor locus was at least around 1.2 million years, in the ballpark of the time of early genus Homo. So we can then recognize early members of our lineage thusly. And I can't overestimate the importance of your sort of concentrating on this image. This is the first time that we've had a terrestrial, open country living mammal with mostly naked skin. Skin becomes the major interface with the environment. It always has been in mammals, but naked skin has never been such an important interface as it has been in humans. So we have intense selective pressure on the barrier functions and the UV protection. So the main hypotheses that have been put forward about the evolution of dark pigmentation, there's a lot of sort of tussling in the literature, but the two major ones that have been put forward in the last 20 years concern the importance of heightened melanin pigmentation in relation to enhanced barrier functions versus UVR protection. I've put this one in yellow and underlined it because it's pretty clear where we've put sort of what basket we've put our eggs in. It's not that we discount the importance of melanin as enhancing barrier functions, but by far all of the experimental and epidemiological evidence would suggest that the primary function of permanent dark pigmentation in our lineage was protection against ultraviolet radiation. But what was the ultraviolet radiation actually doing? First, let's look at the significance of the melanocortin-1 receptor locus, because I think this is incredibly important. Looking at the roles of the MC1R protein itself in the cell. Here we see it on the surface of the melanocyte, the pigment-producing cell, the MC1R protein, and it's serving two major important functions. The first, it activates the DNA damage responses in the cell so that the melanocyte can quickly start repairing its own damaged DNA that has been damaged by ultraviolet radiation, and it is also, and more famously, associated with the production of melanin pigments. I'm going to spend most time today talking and cooing about the importance of eumelanin, which is a remarkable long polymer molecule that has the ability to absorb broadly in the visible and ultraviolet spectrums. So when bright sunlight, strong sunlight impinges on a melanized integument, whether it be of a human or a lizard, there is a tremendous amount of energy that is absorbed by the melanin molecule. The melanin molecule unwinds slightly, and what happens is that there simply is no penetrating radiation that makes it past the eumelanin barrier, or there's very, very little. Pheomelanin, the yellow-red type of melanin that we see broadly in vertebrates. We see them familiarly in Irish setter dogs, as well as lightly pigmented red-haired people. Pheomelanin, I won't talk very much about, but it's a little bit of the villain in the piece. We all have pheomelanin in our skin, but in contrast to eumelanin, pheomelanin actually generates reactive oxygen species when it is bombarded by ultraviolet radiation and contributes to a lot of degeneration of the skin and skin cancer risk. So eumelanin is really sort of the hero of this piece and is a really remarkable molecule. In our original papers, we were able to show that skin reflectance, this is how anthropologists and others quantify human skin color, the amount of visible light of various wavelengths reflected back into a reflectometer, that skin reflectance is very strongly correlated with ultraviolet radiation, especially in the autumn. So even more strongly than latitude is the correlation between skin reflectance of indigenous peoples and ultraviolet radiation. So thinking of it just sort of generally, 86% of variation in human skin pigmentation is accounted for by variation in ultraviolet radiation intensity. Ultraviolet radiation is considered uniformly bad, but it's actually an incredibly important creative force in biotic evolution. In the study of human skin pigmentation, most early workers thought about the connection between the strength of ultraviolet radiation and DNA damage, and that dark pigmentation must have evolved to protect people from the specific damage to DNA caused by ultraviolet radiation. But then, many, many years ago, over 50 years ago, Harold Bloom, the zoologist, pointed out that, rather inconveniently to some, that DNA damage leading to skin cancer rarely affected reproductive success because skin cancer affected individuals after their reproductive careers for the most part. So there was a great sort of quiet sigh in the literature, and people sort of took that off the books. And we began to look at the importance of something quite different, the effects of ultraviolet radiation on folate metabolism. And this was suggested to me by an article in 1978 in Science, where some very clever workers were looking at folate levels in patients who had been subjected to ultraviolet radiation therapy for treatment of skin conditions. And the folate levels in their blood serum and in their red cells were considerably lower than in controls. And they said, well, what's going on here? Why is this happening? But the important fact for me was that you had a molecule, folate, that was essential to many biotic processes, in a variety of life on Earth, that was susceptible to damage by ultraviolet radiation. And this got us really going to think about, okay, what does folate do? We were working at a time when the roles of folate in DNA production and repair were just being fully illuminated in the late 80s and early 90s. And one of our colleagues in Australia at the time was keen at looking at the role of folate deficiencies in the etiology of particular birth defects, especially neural tube defects. And it was the work in Australia, as well as work in many other parts of the world, that led to the realization that folate deficiencies were the major source of these birth defects in the world, and that folate supplementation and fortification could largely remediate this. And so one of the things that I love about this project is it takes me into all corners of biology, including embryology. And when we think about the developing neural tube in any mammal, including ourselves, we have this wonderful sequence of development of the three-layered embryo into a little sort of worm-like configuration over the space of just 3 or 4 or 5 days. And here, this complexly choreographed process of cell division and migration and fusion is entirely dependent on precise cell division. which in turn is entirely dependent on DNA production and in turn on adequate folate supplies. If you don't have enough folate in the system, then any number of birth defects can be developed as a result of folate deficiency in this very early part of mammalian pregnancy, and in humans when most women don't even realize they're pregnant in the first 3 weeks of pregnancy. And we now know, as a result of many more interesting studies done on the dynamics of folate in the skin, that there is significant loss of folate and 5-methyl-tetrahydrofolate, one of the important biologically active compounds of folate, in lightly pigmented but not darkly pigmented skin. We, my husband and I and my lab group, don't actually work on experimental studies of humans in this context. We happily waited for people in other laboratories to sort of take us up on our experimental paradigm, and thank goodness some very enterprising dermatologists have from various parts of the world, and this demonstration last year was very, very interesting. They were able to show that folate levels in the skin dropped and that these in turn could affect systemic folate levels. And so our surmise then was that darkly pigmented, permanently darkly pigmented skin originally became instantiated in the human lineage by a selective sweep that eliminated variation in the melanocortin-1 receptor locus. And this was followed by stabilizing selection, which is still continuing. So here now I want to take us into the Homo sapiens phase. I'm missing out a little bit of interesting stuff, but for the sake of time, we're just going to switch to talking about modern humans and their interesting peregrinations, because this is where we see the final phase of development of the human rainbow. The Homo sapiens phase occupies a long or relatively long period of recent history, 200,000 years ago, roughly, to the present. The vast majority of this having been spent in Africa, undergoing tremendous amounts of cultural and biological, linguistic and artistic diversification. We are originally an African species, but we have become worldwide, and now with extensions to boreal and high altitude habitats, as well as our original habitats in the tropics and subtropics. Active, striding bipedalism and running, just like early members of the genus Homo, a very large brain, about twice as large as early Australopithecines, and increased reliance on cultural buffering and biocultural adaptations. Boy, do humans make it messy for biologists, because humans start mucking around and doing really interesting things to extend and enlarge their niche through deliberate cultural behaviors. And I will talk briefly today especially about the extension, the cultural extensions and changes of diet that made various dispersals possible. My colleague here who works with us at Lake Turkana in paleontology exemplifies the darkly pigmented skin of modern East African people, not only in its rich uniform darkness, but also in the fact that when he is subjected to strong ultraviolet radiation, his skin responds by making more eumelanin. So he starts out as having quite darkly pigmented skin, and it becomes more darkly pigmented when the melanocytes in his skin are stimulated by strong ultraviolet radiation, both UVB and UVA. Now, not all humans stayed in Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago. A few small populations leave for whatever reason and form the ancestors of all non-African modern groups. What solar conditions did they encounter? If we look at sort of the same scenario of the Earth's surface, but think instead of being at the equator, being at the northern hemisphere, the extreme northern hemisphere in winter. UVC is still completely absorbed, and so is UVB. in most latitudes above and below, or well, in excess of 37 degrees latitude in the north and southern hemisphere, there is no UVB for roughly half or more of the year. That is a big biological statement. There's still a lot of UVA, and UVA is very damaging, but it doesn't really do us any good. But the UVB distribution is really important to consider here. So when we go back to our lovely map of UVB distribution, and we think again about what's going on here, especially in the extremes of the northern hemisphere, and the contrast to our sort of ancestral origin and radiation territory here in equatorial and central Africa, we can see that humans are going to be encountering very quickly some major changes. Now, there are quite a few people here who study human evolution, and I'm not going to try to do justice to all the genetic changes that are occurring during this time. But one of the really interesting things 60 to 70,000 years ago and in subsequent dispersals is that we are working with very small human populations. We're not talking about, we think, tens of thousands of individuals. We're talking about a few thousand individuals. And the concomitant reduction of genetic variability plays very largely into this whole study of variation and natural selection in non-African populations. So we have the first non-Africans leaving the Afro-Arabian Peninsula 60,000 years ago, coastal route into Southeast Asia 50 to 60,000 years ago. We can argue about this with some anthropologists, but let's just for the sake of it say 50 to 60,000. 40 to 50,000 years ago into northwestern Europe, 30 to 40,000 years ago into northeastern Eurasia, and again, a tremendous genetic bottleneck event before human dispersals along the coast and along the Siberian land bridge into the Americas. So this is fascinating because this is high-speed dispersal by mammalian standards. It's high-speed dispersal that is powered by tremendous cultural sophistication. People who were living here and evolving here 200,000 to 70,000 years ago were incredibly culturally adept. They had these incredibly diverse toolkits, although they did not yet have the abilities to make sewn clothing. So they probably still were able to cover their bodies with animal furs at night especially and during the day, but they didn't have tailored clothing because needles came much later in human evolution. So skin continues to be the main event at the margin of the human body and central to the study of human adaptation as humans moved into non-equatorial, non-African environments. So what was the epidermis like? Enhanced barrier functions of the stratum corneum, the most superficial layer of the epidermis. So the epidermis becomes sort of even stronger and more resistant, especially to water loss at this time. And, sorry about the long bullet here, but the eumelanin concentration, the darkness of the skin, and the tanning ability we see as being related to the intensity of the ultraviolet radiation in different parts of the world. Here, these two guys, very similar. This one on the left, much less eumelanin. This one on the right, much more eumelanin. This man on the right, much more protected against UVB especially, but also UVA. This man on the left, less protected. These two men are also making vitamin D in their skin. The one on the right at a much slower rate, because the eumelanin is such an effective sunscreen and because it slows down and intercepts so much UVB. So the man on the right, if these two guys are both outside all day, the man on the left is going to make a lot of vitamin D quickly. The man on the right is going to make a lot of vitamin D over the course of the day, but not quickly. This has all sorts of implications for the evolution of depigmentation in the human lineage. But let's think about vitamin D first, because vitamin D has been considered by doctors and pediatricians almost for a century as being really, really important in the absorption of calcium and phosphorus for the diet, from the diet, allowing for proper mineralization of bones and teeth. So you have the classic picture of kids from the Industrial Revolution or kids living in some African and non-African communities today who suffer the terrible deformation of serious nutritional rickets. This is a serious problem to survival in many individuals, especially in young females when the deprivation of vitamin D leads to such deformation of the pelvis that normal childbirth is precluded. In the last 25 years, the classic function of vitamin D has been augmented tremendously by studies by a variety of biochemists, epidemiologists, and others who have looked at what vitamin D does globally for the body. And both in mammals and in humans, we see vitamin D being incredibly important in the control of immune functions and in regulating cellular growth and proliferation, so that in the absence of vitamin D, or in the cases of severe vitamin D deficiency, what we see is a tremendously compromised immune system and a system in which cancers can easily occur. And in connection with the second point here, we now recognize from fairly good, strong epidemiological studies of the last 20 years that increased prevalence of breast, colon, ovarian, and prostate cancer is related to, among other things, vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency over the long haul of a human lifespan. So we have come to talk about dispersals of humans, modern humans, and what we call the vitamin D compromise, that biocultural set of adaptations that allowed humans to move into areas not just sort of subtropical, not even just temperate, but boreal latitudes, and live there permanently throughout the year. One of those concomitants, one of the biological sort of limbs of or legs of the stool would be the evolution of depigmented skin, positive selection for loss of eumelanin sunscreen. And we see this beautifully illustrated in these two women, one Northwestern European, one Northeast Asian, lightly pigmented or more appropriately depigmented skin as a result of changes in the melanin production and melanin packaging pathways, which are marvelously complex and which are mediated by many, many different genes. One of the reasons that we're able to sort of fiddle around with pigmentation so much is that there are so many different genes that contribute to it. There may be about 10 that have a major effect, but then there's another sort of bushel of 100 that have minor effects. And these can be tinkered with and have been tinkered with in human history as a result of various selective regimes and population bottlenecks. And we now know, and this is just too cool for words, we had predicted that these populations would have evolved depigmentation independently, and in the last 10 years, work by a variety of different excellent genetics groups in this country and overseas has led to the discovery that in fact the depigmentation complex in Northwestern Europeans is significantly different from that in Northeastern Asians. In other words, in the presence of strong selection, and I would advance strong selection for vitamin D production potential in human skin, we see strong positive selection for depigmentation. So what are the other elements of the vitamin D compromise? We are now, and the royal we colleagues throughout the world are working to discover genes in the skin that affect the conversion, storage, and breakdown of vitamin D. So the rate of vitamin D conversion in the skin, as well as its storage in the liver and its breakdown in the liver and in other tissues. So what are the other elements? A vitamin D-rich diet becomes essential to modern humans as they disperse into the highest latitudes. What's so interesting here, and we showed this in our paper now 16 years ago, is that at the highest latitudes of permanent human adaptation, above 58 degrees latitude, there isn't, or actually above 52 degrees latitude, there isn't enough UVB in the sunlight over the year to catalyze vitamin D synthesis sufficient to fulfill physiological needs. Humans that were living permanently at that latitude had to also have the technologies, the extractive technologies, to harvest vitamin D-rich foods. And we see wonderful examples of this vitamin D compromise. I'm just going to show you two. People always ask me, Nina, what about the Inuit? They have dark skin. Well, yes, the Inuit live in circumpolar regions, and they have highly tannable skin. So when you look at this classic picture of an Inuit person, you see quite a dark aspect. But actually, if you look, underneath his parka and look at his upper inner arm skin, he has remarkably lightly pigmented skin, but what he has is an incredible ability to make a seasonal tan against a strong UVA load from the water and the reflected UV from the ice and snow. And the Inuit people were sort of able, and others were able to sort of, as I say, buy their way out of having dark pigmentation by having a consistently vitamin D-rich diet. They dispersed into this area of the world with a diet that was based on the extraction of vitamin D-rich foods, whether it would be fish or this nice narwhal that this young man is tucking into. But this was part and parcel of the adaptation that allowed people to stay there. When modern Inuit people dispense with their traditional diets, they suffer terribly from vitamin D deficiency, serious vitamin D deficiency, and all the catalog of metabolic and other physical woes that derives from that. In Scotland, we see another dramatic vitamin D compromise with maximum amounts of depigmentation, and here in this very, very, very low UV environment. I mean, humans do live there. I met a few nice people from the UK today. I know that it really, I'm married to one too. I know that it can happen. But there's a lot of cloud and very little UV. So what you have is maximum depigmentation, no eumelanin in some individuals, or virtually no eumelanin, no tanning ability whatsoever. And a diet replete in vitamin D, cod, and in hinterland populations, preserved herring and cod, along with blood sausages that are very vitamin D rich. So again, when this compromise is upset, then all of the, health problems become strongly manifest. So, the punchline of this story is that skin pigmentation is a classic evolutionary compromise between the demands of photoprotection at the equator especially, and the demands of photosynthesis of vitamin D more strongly expressed at the poles. This is a wonderful example of natural selection on the human body, and those of you who have to teach introduction to biology or teach introduction to evolution, use this example. I know that there are many other wonderful examples in invertebrates and so forth of natural selection, but sometimes stubborn and stupid students don't get them. But they do understand their own bodies, and they're curious about them. And so I think one of the most exciting things to come out of our and many bodies of geneticists' work is that similar skin colors have evolved numerous times under similar UV conditions. And not only depigmentation, but darkly pigmented and highly tannable skin is now emerging as genetically independent in many human lineages. And extremely importantly, that skin pigmentation, for the most part, evolved independently of other phenotypic traits. So when you're teaching classes about human diversity and people say, well, what is it about races? You can say, well, there's not a lot to say, in that biologically, we have a bunch of different characteristics that evolved at different times in different places, and that it's just a matter of historical accident that people chose to create bundles of these characteristics in our history and then talk about them in various ways that I'll mention in a few minutes. So biologically, we can see clearly that skin pigmentation is not connected, and other characteristics like limb length, face shape, and so forth are not connected with one another. Things change. Humans are bizarre, adaptable, disagreeable, quixotic, and they move and they live in cities. And these qualities of humans, their abilities to disperse and migrate at increasing rapidity and over increasing distances, and living in cities, have changed entirely the landscape of human adaptation related to skin pigmentation. When we think about just some of the voluntary movements of people over the last few thousands of years and few hundreds of years, we see migrations of increasing length made possible by sailing ships and then by rail and automobile and air. And then we have a lot, and just to go back to that picture, a lot of people, importantly, moving in a lifetime from areas very far from their natal environment into solar environments very different from what their ancestors evolved under. And we also see lavish patterns of genetic admixture, especially in the cities. And then we have to consider, especially in the Americas, the role of the involuntary migration of 14 million equatorial Africans and East Africans into mostly the New World, although a tiny minority went into Europe, into the Caribbean, most into South America, and then a smaller fraction into North America. A huge number of darkly pigmented African people going into environments, UV environments, into which they were sometimes tremendously mismatched, including much of North America. And the incredible burden, health burden, we don't think of it as that, of vacation travel. Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens and even our ancestors 500 or 200 years ago didn't go on vacation, but they do now. And people do all sorts of weird and wonky things like going to Cancun or wherever and baking in the sun for 10 days. This has created enormous health challenges. So we have increased morbidity and mortality from too much sun exposure, something that never happened. That little Scottish kid that I showed you with almost the translucent skin, almost a molecule of eumelanin in his skin, his ancestors never had to worry about sunburn because there was never the strong sun that would cause a sunburn. But if he goes to Lanzarote, he will get a sunburn. So you see where I'm going. So this is This is a modern problem. This isn't a problem of our history. And we also have, and this is an even bigger health burden to modern societies, including the United States, is the burden of vitamin D deficiency. In the big cities of America, San Francisco, New York, or in Europe, in London, Paris, we have a huge, beautiful mixture of people from every continent living largely indoors and largely bereft of even casual UV exposure. I mean, now I say the vitamin D compromise for most humans living modern lives is mostly broken by urban lifestyles and reduced time spent out of doors. You know, your typical city perhaps isn't Mexico City, but there are a lot of cities that look similar to this. People living in densely packed conditions under very polluted conditions with no ultraviolet radiation, or very little, able to penetrate this dense mop of particulates and chemical pollutants. And the valley effect that allows very little sunlight down at street level, and the fact that people live and work mostly indoors. I mean, you may not work in this call center environment, but I'm, you know, in your wonderful, you know, Davis offices, you're not far off of this. You do live in a rich solar environment, but I would wager that on most days, very few of you actually get any UV exposure anymore. And we also wear concealing clothing most of the time. We also use sunscreen and importantly to protect against the damage caused by ultraviolet radiation. And some of us wear a lot of concealing clothing for cultural reasons throughout the day. So we've really changed the biological baseline on which we're operating. So the vitamin D compromise is also now broken by the reduced consumption of vitamin D-rich foods. Those poor Scots who used to eat nice codfish and cod liver oil stews, now they're lucky if they can get this sort of fish finger kind of sandwich. White fish and many other fish that is commonly eaten by folks, you know, around the world is almost completely lacking in vitamin D. So you may think you're eating a healthy alternative, but you're not. And dark pigmentation is definitely an increased risk factor for vitamin D deficiency, especially in indoor workers or people living at high latitudes where there's very little UVB to begin with, and low UVB environments. One of the things that got me excited many years ago was the prospect of doing a study in South Africa. I love South Africa because I think it's a fantastic sort of crucible of human interaction, many of which has been unpleasant, but from a biological standpoint, it is a fascinating place where you have indigenous peoples that have been added to by expansion of the Bantu language speakers from Western and Eastern Africa over the last 3,000 to 5,000 years, and then added, you know, within the last 500 years, migration from Europe, from northwestern Europe, and migration, incredible, lavish and diverse migration from the Indian subcontinent, Madagascar, and Southeast Asia. So you've got this incredible genetic mashup, incredible sort of palette of human skin pigmentation. And I got interested in trying to figure out how people survived in urban environments, because although we think about Africa as a very sunny place, when you go to the very tip of South Africa, there's very low levels of UV in the winter. And so here in the neighborhood of Cape Town, you have very sort of inhospitable cold conditions. In this former township area, we did a study of UV levels and its relation to vitamin D production in populations with different levels of skin pigmentation. And to make a long story short, this was published in PNAS last year, we were able to show that it wasn't pigmentation that made the difference so much as the amount of time spent out of doors. So there were seasonal fluctuations according to the natural fluctuation of solar cycles, but also there were fluctuations according to personal habits. And more indoor-oriented people, here's our serum vitamin D on the left. The serum vitamin D was lower in both groups of individuals in the winter, and there was vitamin D status was a function of personal UVB exposure, so whether people spent time outdoors or didn't. Now this had a lot of impact because of the vitamin D effect on immune system health. This is what really got me excited about working there. In a country like South Africa, where there's still tremendous levels of HIV and TB co-occurring, compromised immune status contribute significantly to morbidity and mortality from these diseases. And so we were able to show that low winter UV and extremely low winter serum vitamin D led to increased susceptibility to HIV-1 and TB infections. I won't go through all of our methodology, but I was particularly happy about this because it was sort of a nice example of biological anthropology brought into a health framework where we now understand that we can provide, after we do some more validation studies, that provision of vitamin D to at-risk populations will help to strengthen immune systems in vulnerable populations at very, very little cost. This isn't just about health and evolution, because we notice pigmentation. And people, including early systematists like Linnaeus, first put people into categories according to their color. Europeans were white, Americans were red, Asians were brown, Africans were black. That was his initial classification of humans. 10 years later, in a later edition, the 10th edition of the Systema Naturae, he got much more sophisticated and, I would say, adversely so, influenced by many people who had particular views about the nature of human diversity. So we have Americans in the 10th edition described not only as red-skinned, but choleric in disposition. Linnaeus and many other people at the time subscribed to the climatic theory of that humans of a particular physical configuration had particular behavioral and moral proclivities and particular capacities for civilization. So you had Europeans that were white and sanguine, Asians that were brown and melancholy, and Africans that were black and phlegmatic, and so forth. And this was incredibly important. Linnaeus didn't assemble people into races. He didn't call them races, he called them varieties, but his intellectual descendant in matters of human classification, Immanuel Kant, did create human races. And Kant, he was incredibly well thought of during his lifetime. Kant famously didn't travel. He gathered information from others. He read Linnaeus avidly. And I put down to Kant many of the problems of race recognition and racism and race discrimination that linger today because he was so highly regarded. Kant, as an early philosopher, was fascinated by human diversity, wanted to know why people existed in the various colors and configurations. And he, after his extensive armchair study, came up with 4 different races that he called races, and significantly, and departing from Linnaeus, he says these exist in a hierarchy according to their capacity for complex civilization and moral decision making. And this is his hierarchy. And Kant attached moral characterization to physical differences, without a doubt, and considered some races not just different, but inferior. And as I wind down, I want to emphasize the effect that Kant and other thinkers at the time had, because they had influence, and Kant had influence through the spread of the printing press. He had influence as a well-respected philosopher. His ideas about human diversity and the capacity for civilization were really believed. Thomas Jefferson read Kant avidly, and his own, Jefferson's, ideas about the inferiority of Africans and their permanent servitude and slavery in the United States, in the nascent United States, was based on much of what he learned from Kant, and Kant's conviction that people could not change. So we have race definitions that come to be associated with color, leading to racial stereotypes that are promulgated in a variety of creative and mostly very sinister ways from one generation to another, like a cultural virus, leading to, what I call color-associated memes that provide a robust psychosocial template for racism. Do races exist? Yes, races exist because people experience racism, because we have created Kant and many others. Kant is just one brand of race and racism. There are dozens of others that have been created at different times and places in the Caribbean, North America, South America, and in Europe. But the effect is the same, providing a framework for the development of segregated thinking about human difference, and not just different, but better and worse. And the potent effects of a racial hierarchy on human behavior and aspiration cannot be overestimated, because when people think that a racial hierarchy exists, even if they sort of know that scientifically, if they have some lingering ideas about a racial hierarchy, their ideas about their own potential and the potential of others is tremendously influenced. So join me in working in your own way to inoculate our children and our grandchildren against stereotypes based on appearance. It's much easier if we begin to create an educational system, including an educational system in the home, where kids learn about the origins of human physical diversity, a little bit about evolution, instead of having to then teach against or try to displace implicit bias in adults. It's much easier to teach little kids about the beauty of evolution and the beauty of human equality than it is to teach people as adults to eradicate the implicit bias that they have carried with them for a lifetime. So work with me to use skin pigmentation to teach evolution in your classes and to influence your grandkids and the people around you in this way to help make the world a little bit better. Thanks. Yes, yes. Sorry. I can pick them. Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of people have to leave, so yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. A good question here, is there any evidence, genetic evidence for repigmentation? Yes. And we see in South Indian populations, Australian Aboriginal populations, the genomic work is still being done, but yes, as humans disperse into, redisperse into equatorial latitudes and are mostly naked, there is strong, and because it's hot, there is strong positive selection for repigmentation. And what's so interesting about this is that it's not always sort of genetically based, as we called constitutive pigmentation. So it's exposure. So enhanced tanning abilities are seen in a lot of these repigmentation episodes. So, you know, with a big bag of genes in your pocket and these various founder effects, you have all sorts of interesting admixtures and natural selection occurring on admixed populations. It's absolutely fascinating. And watch this space, because there's going to be a lot of cool stuff, not out of my lab, but out of the labs of others elsewhere. Yes?
So I sort of got a similar question, but at a much deeper time
Yes.
scale. So
Yes.
if you think of the early tetrapod invasion of land,
Oh, yes.
maybe this very early selection
Oh.
pressure on skin. And,
Yes.
And then eventually you've, so maybe they were heavily scaled, but not the amphibians. And then you've got birds and mammals
Yes.
that stick hair and feathers.
Yes.
You've got this reinvention of another naked animal with
Yes.
naked apes. Do you see, I mean, is there evidence for sort of reinvention of similar things that happened in the early tetrapod?
Well, I mean, I wish, you know, I would love to be able to go back to the Devonian or you know, and look. But certainly when we look at modern amphibians, we can see that, you know, they have, I mean, the way that they make and package eumelanin is a little bit different from mammals, but boy, you know, you see, you know, strongly eumelanin-rich amphibians that are protecting their bodies and their egg sacs and egg collections with eumelanin. So this was even more of an imperative when the atmosphere was thinner and less oxygen and ozone rich. So this, yes, this was extremely important. And when we reconstruct, especially, you know, sort of naked amphibians and hairless reptiles, we have to think about the importance of protective eumelanin pigmentation.
So once you get hair and feathers, you get a relaxation of the selection pressure?
You get relaxation of selection pressure on the interfollicular epidermis, but you still have to have the dark stuff on the outside. Now, of course, hair and feathers become sort of this compound sort of focus of selection, so that they turn out to be, you know, important for protection against UV, but then they get colored for other reasons. So as long as they're doing their UV job, then the melanin and the keratin compounds can form all sorts of beautiful, you know, colorations that are selected upon in other ways. But the baseline function is very much for protection against UV. Yes, hi.
Two questions. One is, why do we keep our hair and
Yes.
our hair
Yeah.
here? And B, I also would like you to ask, to comment on vitamin D supplements.
Yes.
Not everybody's now running into the grocery store right now.
Yes. With the maintenance of hair on the top of the scalp, almost certainly to provide immediate protection to the circulation around the cranium. We know that the bones of the skull have a lot of, you know, venous, a lot of blood flow in them, a lot of complex venous drainage, and that it is extremely important for keeping the brain cool. So keeping the venous plexus in the cranial bones relatively cool is important to maintaining a brain that can operate within thermally acceptable standards. Now, if you are outside on a sunny day, you can actually feel the heat, especially if you have dark hair, you can feel the heat on the very top of your hair. if you stick your fingers underneath, what you'll feel on that very hot day is that the scalp is actually a little bit cooler. And so we have a hypothesis, which I hope one of my current graduate students is going to test, about the retention of head hair, having to do with the importance of maintaining a barrier layer of cooler air between the surface of the hair and the surface of the scalp to allow sweating and cooling of that skin. With regard to vitamin D supplements, and I'm not a physician, and every individual is not the same, and so please don't go running off to CVS or Rite Aid or wherever. But most people living indoor lives can benefit from taking vitamin D supplements, regardless of their skin pigmentation or ancestry. It's simply because when we live indoors day in and day out, there is very little potential for vitamin D production, and we eat low vitamin D foods. Even vitamin D enriched milk has a scintilla of vitamin D compared to what is actually needed by the human body. It can prevent the most egregious levels of deficiency, but nothing more. So I own no shares in vitamin D production companies, but I think it's a good idea for most urbanized people to take vitamin D. Yes?
Can you speak some more to loss of heat? Because there are many other animals that live in very high climates,
Yes.
but they've got fur, and
Yes.
as you're saying, you can raise it up a little
Yeah.
bit.
And what's so neat about thermoregulation in mammals is that you have very lineage-specific adaptations. So, if you look at your average, sort of topee or wildebeest, they have, a really big nose with, an incredible network of veins draining the nasal conchae so that when they breathe air in, they're getting a lot of cool, inspired air over the blood-infused nasal conchae. That cool venous blood goes to the base of the brain where there's a wonderful carotid reedy that works as a heat exchange mechanism with the internal carotid artery, so that basically you get local brain cooling. The bodies of ungulate animals, for the most part, the temperature of the body goes up, but the brain can stay cool as long as the animals are still breathing in and breathing out. So that is really interesting. Carnivores use pantene, but the same effect occurs. Tremendous evaporation of water from the oral cavity and the cooling of the veins, of the blood in the veins surrounding the oral cavity, goes into a carotid reedy and cools and helps to keep the base of the brain cool. So, primates are perverse or unusual in that they get rid of most of their excess body heat through radiative and evaporative heat loss, which, in the great mammalian scheme of things is perhaps not the best thing, but it's what we're stuck with. And so you have primates that react to high levels of heat, usually by stopping activity. Baboons will run and then they'll stop because they'll get overheated. So will vervets and chimpanzees, because they get quickly overheated. They have very reduced eccrine sweating abilities. So I think this is a fascinating problem. Heat regulation, and it just so happens that our particular lineage of mammal dissipated heat in this way, and that's why we got naked skin, almost certainly. Yeah, go ahead.
So dark skin also seems to be correlated, associated at least, with Kate afro hair.
Yes. Not always, though. If you go to South India. Yeah.
And yet, when we see pictures in textbooks of Homo erectus,
Yes.
Homo sapienciensis, they usually have sort of the chimpanzee primitive
Yes.
hair. How far back in evolutionary history?
Oh, I wish I knew, and one of my graduate students is working on this very question. We know so little about the genetics of hair texture and hair color in humans. I mean, we're beginning to sort of reduce the SNP set so that now we're down to 170 candidate genes. Oh, what fun to try to figure out which one is actually. It's not my job. I'm just working with encourage my students to be creative. But the point is that we don't know when this the tightly curled and frizzy hair evolved, and it evolved convergently because we see very, very tightly curled frizzy hair forms in Melanesian and other Southeast Asian populations as well. So we know that like repigmentation, there was sort of a retexturizing of hair as well. I hope that this becomes much clearer in the next 5 to 10 years because right now we know very little about it.
Will you take one more question?
Yes, I'll take one more. Yes.
Do the positive effects of the vitamin D compromise, in which it mediates immunity and so forth, operate in the furred, non-anthropoid mammals the same way they do, even though they're those hair-covered ones? I mean, is there an analogous function for vitamin D to protect against disease?
Yes, vitamin D is an important universal. If you, for instance, in the early days of keeping lizards in the United States as pets, people just kept them under warming lights in cages. They developed vitamin D deficiencies and tremendous numbers of infections and cancers as a result of chronic vitamin D deficiency. So this is a vertebrate universal. Now, vertebrates vary in how much vitamin D they can produce in their skin because they're going to have slightly different configurations of vitamin D production mechanisms in the keratinocytes of their epidermis. So this varies slightly, but it is a universal. There was a wonderful study done in Norway several years ago to look at the production of vitamin D in the skin of cows because the Norwegian farmers were worried about vitamin D deficiency potentially in their animals. So yes, so they put a series of coats on some of the cows in the summer and then had others that had no coats. And the picture from their article is just precious because you see all these sort of, well turned out cows. Anyway, the long and short of it is the coat-wearing cows had significantly lower levels of vitamin D. So even though they're mostly covered with hair, they are making some vitamin D in their skin. There's some UVB penetration, and we know nothing about the affinity of the vitamin D conversion sort of hardware in their epidermis. They may be able to, produce vitamin D at a much lower threshold than us. But the point is that all vertebrates need this, and they have to get their vitamin D from one source or another.
This is anecdotal and almost banal, but one hears of so many cases of lymphoma in indoor cats, and I was
Yes.
just wondering whether there could ultimately be.
I think it's worth looking at. I mean, I would probably be pilloried if I, even sort of said, oh yes, it's a good idea. But I think these things need to be investigated because vitamin D is such an important aspect of normal physiology. And now that so many humans and their domesticated partners are living in indoor situations chronically, we need to mediate positively. Thanks.